Hello and welcome to the Martin Fiddler Aviation second webinar on risk. Today we are looking at avoidable risks in aircraft transactions. Thank you to everybody who is joining us today. We really appreciate you giving us your time, and we'll try to keep this between 15 and 20 minutes long. So a quick introduction to our experts. We have Martin Kenyuk and Lindsay Fosdell. And today we will be looking at why some risks are more manageable than others. We will be examining our top tips for how you can easily mitigate risk on some transaction items. And then we'll be looking at some commonly asked questions in our section, fact, fiction or fantasy. Just as a reminder, you can catch up on any of our webinars or our news at our website, martinfiddler.aero. So, let's kick off. Last week last webinar, we looked at the key zones where you could try and find risk mitigants. And those zones were mission, team, time, expectations, and the environment. Before we hone down on some easily able actions that you can take to start mitigating risks on transactions, Martin, would you explain why some risks are more manageable than others?
Yeah, sure, Heather. And it's not very complicated. It is simply that some are known and some are not known. So let's not go down that known knowns and unknown knowns and all that kind of palaver. But the things that we do know about in advance that can be anticipated, then you can plan, you can work those in to the transaction. But the other stuff that you can't reasonably foresee, that's when you're relying on the team that you've assembled to be good enough to handle those. And that kind of comes with experience. You want people who have seen things occurring either randomly or in a non-patterned way, and they're able to step in and deal with those with experience.
Great, thank you very much, Martin. Okay, so now to hone in on sort of top 5 tips to easily mitigate. And the first one is going to seem a little bit like common sense, but Lindsay, can you tell us why actually talking to your client and finding out what they want from the transaction is key?
Well, it might sound obvious, but knowing what the owner actually wants is the key to a successful transaction. The client might have personal interests that we need to take into account, such as the date on which the first flight can take place following delivery. So setting out a transaction map at the outset, which details elements of particular importance, can really help to mitigate future issues arising. Once the transaction map has been agreed, our recommendation would be to stick to it as best you can to avoid any delays and ultimately frustrations later on. Seeking input on areas of the owner's concerns or interests can save time and money later in the transaction too, and it's also crucial for clients and their representatives to know and understand must-haves versus nice-to-haves in order to manage their expectations. So an example of this might be where the client has a particular registration mark in mind, but can the aircraft then be operated in the manner in which the client would like whilst using that registration? So in essence, effective communication and fact-finding at the start of the transaction is the key to it being a success.
Thank you, Lindsay. And just on that point about communication and also coordination, Martin, can you explain why effectively communicating and coordinating are an easy way to reduce risk on transactions?
Yeah, sure. So it's almost like you need a brain telling the left hand and the right hand what to do and when to do it for best effect. So somebody who's sitting almost above the transaction, there are so many different parts, as everybody who's ever worked on a transaction will know. There are so many different parts, so many different teams that have got their own things to do and not just one-off actions. Each team is going to have a series of actions, some of which can only happen one after the other, some of which have got to be woven into the actions of the other teams. So somebody coordinating, make sure that things happen at the right times. But then there is that communication. Again, lack of communication means that things won't happen at the right time, but what has to happen and when it has to happen. So not only communicating on a timely basis, but communicating the right message to the right people in the teams who are able to take decisions. Now, whether that's taking decisions of, if you like, of go or no go, or who are able to take decisions when things haven't gone according to plan, when things have occurred that people weren't anticipating, and you do need either to vary the plan, introduce something else into the plan to make sure that it works as a whole. So that's, I think, the two things about coordination and communication that can really reduce the risk in that transaction.
Thank you very much, Martin. Okay, so moving on to quite a topical matter, which is compliance. Lindsay, why is having your due diligence ready to go at the outset such an easy tip for reducing risk?
So just as PPI, title and lien checks on the aircraft are important, knowing who you are dealing with in all elements of the transaction is paramount. This is a very relevant topic, and allegations that are being made in the States at the moment demonstrates that the need for due diligence is increasing across the industry. The regulatory environment we work in means that nearly everyone needs to provide CDD, so have it ready in advance to speed up the transaction. With regards to CDD documents, generally, as a minimum, you can expect to be asked to provide certified copies of passports and utility bills, but more may be required depending on the circumstances and the parties involved. But whether you're a buyer, a seller or a broker, just don't be offended if questions are being asked about source of wealth and source of funds, because we need to be comfortable that the funds that are being used to buy the asset are originating from a legitimate source. And be aware that proof of any payments made are often required so that the source of funds can be verified. So to summarise, compliance is unavoidable in transactions, so be prepared.
Great, thank you very much, Lindsay. So Martin, another top tip that you can do early on, seeking advice?
Yeah, I know it sounds pretty obvious, but don't leave things too late. Don't think that you can just dial up somebody further into the transaction and get them on board. People are often busy. They will have other parallel matters. So getting people on board earlier with the known facts is really useful. And don't fall into that trap of just assuming that because you may have done many transactions in one particular jurisdiction, if you're going to be going into a transaction where there's multi-jurisdictions, don't fall into that trap of assuming that what you're used to is going to be happening and going to be the standard in these other jurisdictions. We know that, for example, on either side of the Atlantic, standards, ways of doing things, terminology, requirements, they can all vary quite dramatically. And getting in there early and getting people on your side is really key to starting to understand what you may have to do further down the transaction.
Great, thank you. And sticking with you, Martin, one thing that we touched on in the last webinar was knowing what time can be moved, what time is set and is rigid, and that might be a short period of time or a longer period of time. Can you talk to that and why this is an easy way to reduce risk?
Yeah, so it's effectively so that you don't run out of time or kind of get yourself into a cul-de-sac. So for some things, they are going to be fixed time scales, maybe registration, maybe financing. So there will be some clear, immovable things that you just can't shift, that you have to work to. But there might be other time scales that you can introduce maybe more people, you can get more done within the time that you've been set. But one of the things that we've recently found, for example, is with transactions that we've been involved with where the aircraft is being exported out of, say, the UK or the EU, it's going to Guernsey, the transaction is going to be completely on the ground there, and then it's coming back into maybe customs warehouse in the UK, something like that. And there's a limited amount of time that an aircraft at the moment can spend on the ground in Guernsey. Now, if you're not aware and clued up to that, you might think that you have all the time in the world to spend on the ground closing the transaction. That isn't necessarily the case. So again, just these things of finding out what actually is the situation there. Now that might be jurisdictional, as it were, because there are differences between different countries, different geographical areas. But given what's happening in the world at the moment, there will be variances taking place. People will be altering their working practices. So don't get caught out by something as simple as that, as assuming that you know what the timescale is.
Thank you very much, Martin. So moving into our next section, I think anybody who's tried to read about transaction management or risk mitigation knows there's an awful lot out there which is theoretical. And theory is fantastic until something goes wrong. And then it's really experience in which you need to place your trust. So we're going to go into fact, fiction or fantasy and some frequently asked questions that we get on transactions. And Lindsay, turning to you first, a comment or a phrase that we often get from a client is that confidentiality is incredibly important to them. So why are they needing to disclose their identity, in particular where there's a back-to-back transaction going on?
Well, a big myth in the industry is that you can hide behind brokers in a transaction, but that simply isn't the case. All parties want transparency in a transaction, whether it's back-to-back or not. And understanding where money is coming from and who you're dealing with is really important. In most well-regulated jurisdictions, you're unable to avoid the compliance aspect of the process, and legislation is such that we need to look through to identify the ultimate owners when carrying out due diligence and security checks. Great,
thank you, Lindsay. Now, Martin, another thing that we hear quite frequently is where there is a sudden rush on the transaction, the timescales have been moved, suddenly the aircraft is due to complete next week. Is it possible to close and do the paperwork afterwards?
Good question. So we kind of understand and you come across the commercial imperatives and times often money. But I think where you're employing professional advisors, if they're telling you that the paperwork needs to be done as things in the real world are happening, then that's really what you should abide by. People are employing specialist advisors to give their specialist advice so that things are happening, so that things are happening properly, so that there's less risk and the overall transaction works. So it's really inadvisable to try and do make-up paperwork afterwards because it simply doesn't fit with what's happening in the transaction. You might find that maybe for legal purposes or for taxation purposes, something's now being put in jeopardy because the paperwork didn't happen at the correct time. So it's really advisable not to do that. And yet, again, if people are doing that, they're just upping the risk.
Thank you, Martin. So our last question on this webinar is one that we do hear frequently, and it's generally because of the significant values of aircraft. And the question is, do I have to pay the tax? Now, everybody needs to account for the tax, whether you can save all, part, none of the tax is completely down to individual situations. And just because somebody knows somebody else who managed to mitigate the tax does not mean that the client we're talking about is able to pay the tax. Anyway, that draws us to a close on this webinar. Thank you very, very much for joining us. We've covered why some risks are more manageable than others. We've given you some top tips on how to easily mitigate risks, such as collecting the CDD in advance or just talking to the client as to what they actually want to achieve. Our next webinar will be looking at what to do when the unexpected happens on an aviation transaction and how to handle that. We will let you know the dates for that very soon. If you want to catch up on any news, our webinars or anything else, please do visit our website, martinfiddler.aero. We are here. If you've got any questions, please do not hesitate to ask. Thank you so much for joining us. Stay safe and bye-bye.